Hi everyone, happy International Youth Day. Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on understanding critical media literacy. I'm Kendra Gomez from UNDP Sri Lanka and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. So just to give you a small overview, the Engage to Disengage program is an awareness building and training program developed by UNDP Sri Lanka in partnership with the Asia Pacific Center of Education for International Understanding under the auspices of UNESCO, which focuses on critical media and information literacy for youth. This webinar series, which is organized in partnership with Raw Media, is part of a tripartite webinar series on the topics of critical media literacy, conspiracy theories, and fake news, and the prevention of violent extremism. So do keep a lookout on our social media if you would like to be a part of the next two webinars in the coming weeks. So just to give a few house rules before we proceed today. This is a 1-hour session and will be recorded for program purposes. At the end of the presentation by the experts, we will move on to an open Q&A session where we would like to engage with you all. So do please type in your questions in the Q&A or chat box, and we will direct these to the experts at the end of their session. If you would still like to use your mic to ask a question, please do raise your hand and the panelists will unmute and give you the opportunity to speak. Please do keep this in, please do also keep in mind to keep your questions short and concise due to time constraints. So let me hand it over to the two experts who have joined us today. Sakeena Razick is a journalist at Raw Media. She's passionate about social justice and change, and she's interested in economics, international relations, and human-centric stories. Prior to this, she has worked at a local think tank as a researcher. And we also have joining her Kris, who is also a journalist from Raw Media, who is an avid follower of stories of the lesser known, unheard, and often unspoken human conditions. He has worked in print media and digital media previously, and has reported on various beats. So over to you, Kris and Sakeena.
Whenever there's like an overload, that obviously leads to fears among the public. There are so many opinions, there are so many perspectives, there are so many angles to one particular story or an incident. When that happens, how do you deal with the anxiety that comes with it? There's this really cool concept called doom scrolling, where you end up just scrolling and it's always bad news that's happening. So in order to understand and reevaluate what is going on in the world, context is what's important.
There's actually been research to prove that critical media literacy has a direct connection to positive mental health, because this means that you can pick and choose how you really read and how you understand what you see on the internet or on TV or on any platform. So we are going to talk about this particular topic. More so from a journalist point of view, as you mentioned. So we're going to start right at the beginning of how a news story is made.
So yeah, traditionally, when you think of a journalist and whatever role he or she has to play, you immediately think about something that happens and a journalist going to cover it and report on it. That has been the case since forever. But now, with the advantages of technology and how complex the world has become, things have also developed into a more complex scenario or an environment. But right now, journalists don't just report on a particular topic; they also have take into consideration everything else that happens simultaneously. Whatever the views that are taking place online.
The trending topics. The tweets. Sometimes journalists are also invited to press conferences. Yeah. That's another event. That's not necessarily a sudden event that happens, but that is something that is happening, and there's some news.
It's always a developing incident. When that happens, how do you deal with that? It's not just the task of writing or reporting a particular story. It's also about disseminating the right information and combating fake news. Yes. Or misinformation or disinformation, whatever that is out there.
Verifying, and just verifying. So
basically, reporters are also fact checkers. Fact checkers have become and a significant part of the news
Yes,
process.
and we'll talk about that later as
Yeah.
well. But in terms of like at Raw, what we do mainly is that we might not at that moment itself address a particular event or particular news story, but we kind of conduct more in-depth stories. Most often that's there in our feature articles and sometimes our video, and we always want to add a little bit more to what we do or what we publish and what is being said. So sometimes this means we're a little bit behind on the time span or timeline out of choice, but we thought we'd just share a few stories and talk about how we kind of got to them. Yes. So I'll start. The first one is the Monrovia Water garbage dump, which is a place near Braskamma. It's called Monrovia, in Gaul, Monrovia Estate. And just to begin with, we just saw a few tweets. And it was just, and we kind of got in touch with this NGO that have been talking to people who were complaining about certain boils on their skin and water contamination. And that led us, I think somewhere around 7 to 8 calls later, that led us to realize, like, we really understood that this is actually because of a garbage dump that has not been following protocol. And this amazing project that had actually started initially kind of burst, and this was affecting agriculture, this was affecting people, and the village was also suspecting that this had led to the death of one person in that area. And we decided to really take some time, because initially there was also a news story that followed up. There wasn't a lot of coverage on this issue. There was just one other news story that followed up saying, oh, everything had been fixed, everything's fine. So we called, we verified, we double checked, we realized this is actually not true.
How long did it take for you to do this?
About 3 weeks, I think, because so then we went there and then we met the people who were great. They got a whole team there to tell us exactly what their story was there. And we also make it a point to generally follow up at Raw. So 6 months down the line, we've been talking to them. So they're still in their lobbying process, and they've been using the article as well to help them with their lobbying. But the issue is still very much prevalent. I think it's something that hasn't really gotten a lot of coverage, but it really just started off with just a few 2 news articles and just tweets, and then we just kind of followed up. You can talk about Manthi.
Manthi is basically an island somewhere in Batiklo. It's very close to Batiklo town, around 2 kilometers or so, and it has one of the 2 leprosy colonies. Leprosy colonies, obviously, you know, that were introduced during the colonial times, where they basically alienated patients with leprosy, so that the disease doesn't spread to the healthy people in the society. This is actually one of the 2, and the other one is in somewhere around Colombo. And this hospital or leprosy colony actually has 3 surviving patients. But even though they have been cured of the disease, since they have been abandoned by their families and their loved ones, they are still living in this particular colony. It's a 99-acre island surrounded by the sea, with only 1 boat going to and fro from the mainland. And these 3 patients have no contact other than the hospital administration, which are like 5 people, and they have no contact with the rest of the population of the society.
How did you first come?
I actually came across this on this particular document written in the 1800s by this survey department engineer. It was, I think, 1800s, and it basically gave an outline of how this island is managed and the number of buildings, and it actually piqued my interest. And starting from there, we had to make bunch of phone calls. We had to take permission from the health ministry, and it was more or less around 5 to 10 interviews that I had to make, and before I actually had to go visit the hospital. And this was the final result.
And moving on to the next story, it was
which is more recent.
Yeah, which is very recent. This was a little bit after lockdown, when we had repatriation flights back. But interestingly, at that point, there had been no flight yet from Saudi Arabia, and very little communication to a lot of people. So while a few of them had gotten calls, a few others hadn't. So this particular story was interesting in the sense that we had to do a lot of follow-up and calls with people who were in a different country, and even then make sure, because you're just talking to somebody who you can't even see, so you lose out on something that most journalists absolutely love, that's human-to-human interaction, where you can interview somebody, you can read their kind of facial expressions. So we didn't have any of that, which we'll also talk about in our next story, which is also during COVID. But during this time, we also had to get the other side. So we had to call Saudi Arabia, talk to the Sri Lankan embassy there, get their side of the story, which is really important. We'll talk about that as well.
Giving the other side of the story.
Giving the other side of the story. And then the next story is something both Kris and I worked on, which is a compilation of like multiple stories during
took around 2 weeks and around 20 interviews.
Yeah, and we were really struggling, particularly during this time, because this is unprecedented. We had no idea what was happening. Suddenly there's a lockdown. You can't do your usual call somebody, ask them to meet you in the evening, and then follow up with an interview, set up an interview, do a couple of calls and verification. Couldn't do any of that. And usually one of our main sources of verifying are government agencies. But during this time, they were not at work, and then offices were closed. And how do you, that was also a struggle to be able to get the other side of the story while you are at home under curfew. And you're
supposed to be talking to government officials, and you don't have their personal contacts. And even if you do have their personal contacts, most of the time they're not answering their phones. How do you go about verifying the information you have?
So
that has been one of the biggest challenges that we faced during the curfew period, the lockdown period.
And I think one of the best things about this is that everybody in our office just kind of really came together and helped us, where everybody was stationed sometimes in a different part of the country. So that's how we really got to report, even though we were actually really just stuck at home. But
even though we were not on the ground, we were getting stories from the ground.
So we just want to talk about a few of our stories just to truly help understand how news stories work. And then we're just going to go into, so that's
something
part of,
we spoke about
it. A journalist's job is to find the story, report it, write it, make sure it's accurate. But nowadays, it's really a twofold job. There's also debunking fake news, because just when you are writing a story, there's also so many different narratives. Different people are saying these different things, and you're not even sure if that's true. So you have two roles. You do your story, but you also take up the news, the fake news, and the responsibility, and kind of figure out what's being told, and really be able to debunk that if possible.
That comes to the point where who gets to say what. Traditionally, media organizations have editors who decide what gets published and what stories should be focused on. But when it comes to citizen journalists or social media, they have the advantage of not having someone to tell them basically what should be published and what should be given attention to and whatnot. That is somewhat of a disadvantage when it comes to traditional media or mainstream media. But we have the mainstream media, including new media, has the responsibility of giving the attention to the right topics instead of focusing our attention or focusing the attention of everyone into multiple ideologies.
And Kris mentioned citizen journalism, which is just a phrase that we refer to in the sense that because now it's not just journalists who are telling the story, or reporters or correspondents placed everywhere in other parts of the world, but it's just people, because that can be breaking news and they might be at that event, but most of the footage, most of the initial news could just be from people. And this has again it's a double-edged sword. There's a positive and a negative. It means that there's more information out there, but information by people who do not have accountability or do not have their own gatekeeper, because now everybody has the right to publish with social media. That's become that's one of the main reasons why critical media literacy is important.
And we have seen clear examples of this lack of accountability. We saw in 2017 and 18, social media got blocked, and in 2019 as well, social media got blocked because of the surge of fake news and viral messages going on, being shared while there were violent riots and happening somewhere like in parts of the country. These are some of the articles that we have come across, and some of our colleagues,
yes.
some of our colleagues have written as well. And and another example, the most recent example is obviously the Easter Sunday attack, when we saw the examples of the double-edged sword, the advantages as well as the disadvantages of this double-edged sword, that is the social media. We were receiving information very quickly through social media whenever something was happening during this particular time. We still do. But on top of that, we were receiving false news, disinformation, as well as misinformation in this time. When we were actually covering it, I remember like there was various conspiracy theories that were being shared. One of them was about how water tanks and like public water supply was contaminated as part of this this attack as well. And there were several messages and like text messages and like memes, like whatnot, even posts, like it was being shared like everywhere. And it becomes the journalist's responsibility to address this. Otherwise, by staying silent, we are letting something happen when it is our responsibility to address it and debunk it. That is where the new added responsibility of the added task of debunking fake information has also come across.
Yeah, but it also becomes really difficult because journalists are also
it's more
working. Yeah, it's more work. You're working in a really difficult timeline and a time span, and sometimes verifying something that's really small, it can just be one sentence, might take you multiple calls, at least between 10 to 20, depending on, and it might take you multiple sources. So in that sense,
it's never just one phone call.
Yes, and you might get late to debunk it. So that's where citizens' responsibility comes when they're sharing it. Even before it's been debunked, you yourself can double check and verify. And then we'll again talk about this later.
Yeah.
Another thing that's interesting and also kind of poses a difficulty, but also, it's not necessarily a bad thing, is the idea of freedom of expression and information and opinion, which again, you see a lot more and you have more access to because of the internet and because of social media. And here, when everybody's entitled to their opinion and everybody's opinions should be respected, it becomes difficult when sometimes these ideas or opinions go against certain values. And maybe sometimes it can just be an overload of opinions. How do you decide which opinion are you going to follow? And how do you decide which opinion are you going to share? And a big part of this could just be reading through completely, because something that's very common is just that
instead of reading just the headline,
and then everybody just loves to share it. But I'm just going to talk about a particular case study, which is an international case study. So this is a New York Times article that was published in June during the Black Lives Matter protest. After the death of murder of George Floyd, sorry. And at the height of these protests, New York Times, which also has an opinion segment where they allow other people with other opinions to write, published a piece called "Send in the Truth." So on your left-hand side, you will see the first title that was called "Send in the Troops," and the headline was perceived as also misleading because technically this is an opinion piece, and lots of people, there was a lot of backlash that that this opinion piece shouldn't have been published initially at all. At the beginning, New York Times defended that position. They said we shouldn't only publish what we believe in, but we should publish any opinion. And this is a senator who was advocating to send arms in the military into the protest to just kind of quell the protest. And then they changed it to include his name, to make it very clear that it is an opinion piece. Tom Cotton, Send in the Troops.
This is that one, right?
Yes. And then after that, there was still so much angry backlash on Twitter. People were unhappy that it affected not just the journalists, it affected their movement, the Black movement, the lives of Black people. And the New York Times editor who had initially defended the article, amidst all of this backlash, resigned. Which brings into like a question of how important a headline is and how you read it, and how important reading the article and then reading through the full thing. Because I read it before it had been corrected, and initially I was a bit surprised, but then when I read the full article I realized it wasn't a usual.
So it wasn't just an attention-grabbing headline, but it was more or less a...
And it said opinion. So,
okay.
I mean, I could argue that that's somebody's opinion, and they are very clearly publishing it within their opinion piece. But then somebody else could say, but that headline is misleading, consider the circumstances, consider the context. And then it also brings into question the other thing about where do you draw the line about the power that the public has at this point? Should the public be able to digest this information with proper understanding and be okay? Or if the headline is misleading, if they're unhappy with the content, does it mean that it could lead to the loss of somebody's job?
Okay. Fun fact, this happens in Sri Lanka as well. We have the Press Council and the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority, who whenever there's like when someone does not agree with an article or a report that has been published, can complain to these authorities and they can respond accordingly. They will create a platform where the complainant and the complainer can be brought into the same platform, and in order to resolve this conflict.
Oh, that's
it happens.
Okay, but this didn't follow a process. This is completely social media.
Yes.
This is completely public.
So in Sri Lanka, it doesn't really necessarily consider social media as a social media's response, but it's available.
And then we also want to touch on a few ethics. This is in relevance to us or in relevance to any journalist, but also important for somebody who's digesting media or reading the media to really understand some of the difficulties and maybe form your own opinions about this. We'd love to talk more about it. So the first thing is, are there any impartial media houses? And we would say no. Because you sometimes have, let's say, on the red spectrum.
If you take it as a spectrum.
Yes, so if you take it as a spectrum, you would have organizations that are sensationalist, use propaganda, use headlines, however they want to, have very little care for what they report. And as long as they get the views, as long as they get the people's interest and attention-grabbing headlines. And
they'll always publish everything in block capitals. The headlines will be huge, the font size will be big, and it'll definitely grab your attention. This is what's technically called yellow journalism in this field. It sensationalizes news, and it mostly deals with propaganda, post-truths, and disinformation. When you want to criticize or basically criticize a particular party or an individual, this is what you do. And on the other side of the spectrum,
and why we say no media house is impartial is because if you're going to completely be neutral, you can't have an opinion that is even on human rights or on gender sensitivity. And there are lots of organizations that consider these when they're reporting. And on that sense, there itself, you are not impartial. But that's a good thing, at least I think so. And in order to be completely right there in the middle means that you give due weight to everybody. So if you are, just to take an example, if you're going to talk about the issue of climate change, right? And let's say you are a TV, a broadcaster, and you give this many minutes or certain, let's say 5 minutes or 10 minutes to a climate change activist, then do you have to say, oh, as an impartial media organization, we need to give 10 minutes, the same 10 minutes to a climate change denier? And that has actually sparked a lot of question in international organizations, particularly where they've decided that sometimes their coverage on climate change, in their effort to show both opinions, has also actually created problems, because you need to give, and this is what we believe in journalism, is that you need to give due weight to the topic, not necessarily equal weight to both topics.
Think of it this way: if you're truly neutral, and if you're giving the same amount of attention to both sides of the story or multiple sides of the story, what can the reader or the viewer or the audience what can they get out of it? Wouldn't they be more confused? If you're giving so many angles to this one particular incident, wouldn't it just confuse them instead of actually informing them to make a proper decision.
Yeah, so there's really a difference between reporting accurately and reporting without any bias, which is important, and be able to, like, for example, with the migrant worker story, to be able to take both sides of the story and to be able to understand that just because somebody tells you one story doesn't mean that is the only side of the story, and that there may be other problems that you don't really understand. But then there's a whole, the being an impartial media house on a whole, and really just having no say on, like, human rights or lies and the truth. That's a whole other argument.
Basically, you end up just reporting the facts then.
Yeah,
which is
might as well be
interesting.
Robot.
Reporting on sensitive subjects. This is also one of the harder ethics to deal with when it comes to being a journalist.
And we thought it would be interesting because, if we tell you what we find difficult and what has been a struggle within from a journalist point of view, it really help understand where, when you all are reading, when anybody who's in journalism is reading the news. So I'll explain the international example, which is the first title is the first original title that BBC ran with. And it says, 2 girls die in honor killing over mobile video. And again, there was public outrage there, and people said, okay, can't call it honor killing, it's actually a murder. And they had to change their headline to say, Pakistan girls murdered over phone video footage.
And it happened on the same day.
Absolutely, and because it was breaking news, and it was just that slogan, so it was just a tweet there. And that really, that's something that we've debated amongst ourselves as well. And the question there is that if you're reporting, you have to report what happened. And changing honor killing to murder doesn't necessarily give the right exact understanding of what happened. But then also we have to be culturally sensitive, sensitive to the kind of changing conversations. So that's a challenge that we see and that all media organizations have, and that is still really just constantly being debated and understood. And do you want to talk about something we went through?
Something definitely. So if you look at this example on your right hand side, it happened when we were working on a story. This particular screen grab is from part of a larger story that we were covering about how individuals can get tested for COVID. And this particular person we interviewed, he had recently come from abroad. He had visited Malaysia, and he had certain symptoms that he thought might be connected to COVID. So what he did was he went to IDH and got himself tested, and he shared the story with us. And we published a document that said he was tested negative for COVID, the PCR test showing up as negative, which he provided to us as part of the interview. When this story was published, we received one comment saying, asking whether this was ethical for us to publish something that is private to the patient. Basically the person's private medical information. And we saw the reasoning behind it. So what we did was we consulted with the industry experts, and we decided that since we had already, that the person himself had provided the information willingly, and we had received explicit permission from him, that we were in the right. But in order to be sensitive of the public perspective, we put out a disclaimer as well, saying that we received this particular piece of information with his permission, and this was the ensuing result.
And so in addition to within media ethics are also what kind of news, what kind of stories do you see that can be difficult to read? And one particular example is the much loved news curry, which is my example for satire and satirical news. And here there's actually been actual cases of people that I know who've initially read the headline and thought of it as real news and not understood that it is actually satire, and
that it's a joke.
That it's a joke, but that can have some truly lasting consequences, because the way you read a news and the way you understand it, and then the way you convey it to somebody else after that can really spark a whole other conversation.
Absolutely.
And so that's just one example.
When you have satire, there's also disinformation, where this example on the right again. Why am I always on the right? The bubonic plague. There were news reports about the bubonic plague being reported in China. This was reported in, I think, last month, the height of the COVID pandemic. And the article said that if you don't know what bubonic plague is, it's normally called the Black Death. That happened. That is spread through rats. It's spread by this particular bacteria, yes, and it was very prominent during medieval times. So it's deadly. It killed almost 50% of the population at that time. And for a news story like that to be reported at this particular point in our time and focused on China is an obvious anti-China reportage that was happening. And the facts were all obviously against this particular story. The bubonic plague, since being discovered, has been like reported almost annually. If the statistics are right, as far as I remember, there are at least 70 cases of the bubonic plague being reported annually in the US alone. And this was targeting China, which is clear disinformation and propaganda.
And it can really create a lot of anxiety.
Exactly.
And stress during this time, because we're already in the middle of a different pandemic.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when this first came out, we were actually at office, and Kris said, "Oh, I think this is wrong." Like he's the science nerd, he follows medical history, and it's just like, I'm sure Black Death is like, it's quite common. And I was like, oh please, you think you know the news. And he was right. And it's something that it's so easy to read something and not really know exactly what
it's so easy to read something and get carried away.
So when we're talking, so we're kind of at the end now, I guess. So the point of just explaining all of this is to explain from our side how we report, how we understand, and what we struggle with, and really just maybe suggest a few things that will help in getting yourself acclimatized to critical media literacy.
Being media literate?
Yeah, and to critically analyze what you see, so that you can choose what you want to read, choose your proper sources, and really decide for yourself what you want to see on social media. That's something that I think, like, for mental health really helps. And most importantly, despite what you read, you can form your own opinion, and you can really
and not get on a bandwagon that because
everybody else is saying it.
Yeah.
So we're going to use an example to really just kind of talk these 5 points. We're going to talk about a skin whitening advertisement.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you see a skin whitening advertisement, one of the first questions you should ask is,
who created this message?
Do they have something to gain from it?
What's their agenda?
Exactly. And what is attracting my attention? Is it a fair, pretty girl? Why is it a fair girl? What are they trying to say there? And why does it have like 3 different girls and one's dark and then constantly changes?
Why is there a spectrum of color changing constantly?
And why is that important? Which is, and then the third one is, what are the other perspectives?
What's the other side of the story? What are the other debates that surround this particular topic?
And that's the positives of social media and the internet, in the sense that you have so much more access to information. So if you are unaware about something that is being said, there is no excuse, in the sense that it's a click away. And it's true, it's very difficult to always be verifying everything and double checking everything, but it's important. So what are other people talking about on this particular issue? It doesn't have to be skin whitening that you type in. You could type in color, you could type in product. And then also what values have been represented in or omitted from this message. Does this advertisement really talk about all of the values around color? Does it talk about colorism at all? What are they trying to say here?
Does being fair actually, I don't know, change the weather? Or
why is this important? And
would people treat you better if your skin was
Which is something, which is part of the argument,
Yes.
right? And lastly, why has this message been sent? So
what's the purpose behind
what's the purpose behind, who has what to gain? And you, if you are informed and if you're critically analyzing this, can truly understand what is being said and then form your own opinion and choose to regard or disregard this message. Yeah. But done, we can hand it over to Kendra. I don't know if there are any questions.
Please ask questions.
I don't.
Hi, okay, thanks Sakeena and Kris. That was really informative. Thank you so much. We've already started getting a few questions, but a reminder to everyone else, if you guys do have any questions, please do type it in the Q&A or the chat box, and we will then pose it to Sakeena and Kris. So I can start off with some of the questions that have come. We have a question from Udara, I'm not too sure, Dharmasena. If a media house is standing for the rights of a minority group, would you consider them being partial? If a media house is standing for the rights of a minority group, would you consider them being partial in this instance? What is your opinion on that?
Sure. So I think that stems into our conversation about how no media house is completely neutral, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. And that is where I would say that this can also be a good thing. And it's really about how you execute it. So I would say that I would consider them being partial, just like the way we would report on environment. When we report on environment, we don't always say just by talking about this environmental problem, but there are also other people who say that this is completely untrue. We talk about the problem at hand because we believe that is what needs due weight. Yeah. So when we talk about a issue of a minority group, that's partial, but that's not a bad thing.
I think what actually defines whether that particular media house is partial or not, regardless of what minority group they're representing, is how they actually address those.
Yeah, it's how you execute it and how you talk about the particular issue.
Yeah,
that's what I think.
I hope that answers the question.
We have another question from Paha. What are some of the tips you all have on being unbiased when writing a piece? And also, what advice do you have for someone that's considering journalism as a profession?
So I think, sure. So maybe I can talk a little bit about first about somebody who's considering journalism as a profession, because unlike Kris, I haven't been in journalism completely. I moved from research to journalism. It was just something I was so interested in. And I think there a big part is taking that step to decide if you want to start freelance or decide if you want to join an organization, and on the other side, decide what platform truly interests you, because we're coming from a more writing and digital perspective, but it really doesn't have to be that. It can be media, I mean, it can be print or it can be TV. So you decide that, and then you kind of take a step there. I'm sure Kris has other tips as well, but and from there I would also say, let's say if it's writing, I would just say, even if you are still completely unsure, you could just start writing on the side. You can contribute to Rome. We
have a contributor platform.
Yes, and
which you could contribute to.
Super excited every time somebody wants to contribute. So and then we kind of help the person work through the article, and then we kind of go from
There's
there.
obviously an editing process, but feel free to contribute your articles. Send us a pitch if you have an interesting story to tell.
Do you have any more advice for someone that's considering journalism
as a profession?
Yes. So that's how to get into journalism. Yeah. I just start the talk.
Don't do it for the money. But yeah, as a profession, it's a very interesting subject. Like I entered the profession because I wanted to meet people and I wanted to travel, and definitely it has taken me places where I've thought I would have never gone. And I've been able to tell the stories of people that I've never thought of talking to, and that has been like a great experience. And what Sakeena said was right, completely true. If you're thinking about writing, start writing now.
Even if you just do it for yourself, just start writing, start talking to people. Yeah, start a blog.
Contribute to Rome.
start talking to people, really just kind of get your curiosity out there. And then if you decide to join a media organization, that curiosity just becomes nurtured by your editor and the team that you work with, and that's really a positive. But I think I hope that answers, but if you have any follow-up questions, please ask.
Yeah.
And what are the tips you'll have on being unbiased when writing a piece?
I think that's something that we struggle with as well. Like, that's where critical media literacy is important for journalists
as well as the public.
Yeah, as well as the public. So tips per se would have been, you look at the broader picture. If you have come across a particular story and say one person is telling you this story, something he or she went through, a struggle that he or she experienced. You look at the story, you listen to him very carefully, and you develop this sense of looking at it from an outsider's perspective. That's how you look at the broader picture. You talk to the other people who are involved in this particular scene, in this particular scenario, then you manage to get the other perspective as well.
Yeah, and something that our editor has actually told us is to just, when you go into the story, make no assumptions.
Absolutely.
You do not already know, because
Everything.
you are going in trying to find the information. And that really helps, because we do a lot of human-centric stories, so it's really difficult sometimes when somebody's telling you the story, but you have to have a little kind of antenna that says, this person could be lying to me. This is a really difficult, sad life story, but this person could be exaggerating, and
which happens a lot.
Which happens so much. And another thing that really helps is talking to somebody else about your story. So I really find it helpful, actually, just talking to Kris, my editor, and that helps, because we often think very differently. So we argue a lot, and a lot of people in our team think very differently. So what that helps is that it brings in other perspectives, and that means that you are just out of your own head and you're really thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
I have a question to you guys.
Yes.
As young people, especially it being Youth Day today, like, how important is critical media literacy as young people, as young journalists, the two of you all, like, how important is it, and how important is it for us to be more vocal about this and let more people know about it, like, just to give an understanding of the importance of the topic that we spoke of today?
I think it's very important. Like, we spoke about it, like, in the last question as well. In order to develop that sense of, being unbiased.
Yeah, and you that's your responsibility as a citizen, because I think what's happened is also, especially because we spoke about social media, there are no rules around this, right? You are allowed to share whatever you want to share. You are allowed to post. So the only way to really tackle this bigger picture of fake news, which I know that we'll be talking about at the next session, is kind of creating an internal consciousness within people.
Like a compass.
Yeah, and saying, please, can you double check before you WhatsApp forward? Please. I mean, it's been an argument that I've had at home so much. And I think it's also important, just like we spoke about in terms of mental health, but it's also important in creating a proper space of information, and not just for journalists and just the general public, but even part of the general public is children, because children find it a lot harder, and the youth find it a lot harder to deal with it, to create a context around it, maybe because they might not understand everything. I mean, I say youth, I mean school children, I think 20 plus truly understand it. So I think that's also really important. Yeah, and because, as we spoke, if there's no critical media literacy, and in a space of no critical media literacy and so much fake news, this can actually lead to, the extreme case of it can be riots and death.
I mean, it's a recipe for chaos. It's a recipe for disaster. The more you know,
the better.
Yeah. We did practice that.
Yes, exactly. We also have a question from Prashani on the Sri Lanka Press Council was mentioned. Are they involved in debunking fake news on mainstream or social media? Or is there a standard code of ethics that is at least being promoted among media houses? What's your experience on that?
There is a standard code of ethics that were introduced in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. It's old, but it's in the process of being reformed. But the code of ethics. The code of ethics is there. It's what guides. It was created by the Sri Lanka Press Council and the Editors Guild of Sri Lanka, and it's there. It's mostly concerned with newspapers. The original document actually focused only on newspapers. So the reformed, the renewed versions actually include newspapers, magazines, and whatnot. When it comes to digital media, there's a different regulatory body, which is the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority. But when it comes to debunking fake news on mainstream, also mainstream, yes. Social media, no. SLBI is not involved. SLBC is not involved in debunking fake news on social media. But mainstream, yes. But someone has to make a complaint for them to address it together with the complainer and the complainant.
Okay, I think we've got quite a few questions coming in. We are also running out of time, but maybe we can look at a few more. There's one saying, thanks for the great talk. I think this sort of critical stance towards the media publications on the internet is absolutely something younger people can and should do. But what about elderly people who are more trusting of publications? Should and can we expect them to be as critical as us?
So I think sometimes we underestimate the elderly,
Absolutely.
But also with reason, because something that I've seen just with elderly people close to me is that they come from a time where anything that is really just said in a text, because they're used to getting the information from print, means that it is true. And
the written word is gospel.
The written word, exactly. And that is why WhatsApp forwards within just the older community is actually something that's increasing and something
WhatsApp,
that, we really, and Viber is actually very popular in Sri Lanka, especially even outside of Colombo. So here, I think the first step has to be just conversation and just awareness. And that's why sometimes these webinars and talks can seem kind of, it can be much, but it's also helpful because that's really just the only way. Because I mean, I just a funny example, but I just sent this article that we did, a WhatsApp forward article. So talking about all the fake WhatsApp forwards during COVID time to an elderly person who had been sending me most of these WhatsApp forwards. And the response to that article was a WhatsApp forward. So then I realized, okay, I need to just sit with this person and talk to them, because that's just the way they think. And who knows, like centuries, years from now, there might be a whole other kind of platform, and we would believe anything that's on social media, but maybe, or like we would have a way that we analyze it, but you might have to critically analyze it so much more.
To a certain extent, the youth also has a responsibility. If you're engaging in media literacy, critical media literacy, you have the responsibility. Responsibility might be a bit too extreme of educating those who are not very literate.
And if you can watch what you share, that means you are already reducing the kind of information that's available on the space.
Absolutely.
So yeah, sorry we don't have a definite answer for that, but hope we helped.
Okay, I think to end with, we can have one more question. How are politically and socially sensitive topics covered without drawing public criticism, maintaining critical and accurate reporting on stories?
That's a mouthful.
Okay. So I think that is something that there is no definite answer, in the sense that that is something that you just have to create checks and balances within your organization, and you need to question yourself at the same time. So there is no set like right and wrong that you can have, because it has to constantly keep evolving. But the only way that you can and I think it's also important, that's where an editor really helps. That's why we spoke about gatekeepers, and in organizations you have an editor to play that role of really thinking about, fine, that the editor's gotten that information, now is this the way it's going to be produced, how best is it done? And in that, as long as you know that your story is true and accurate, and that you are telling it in the best way that is possible. Sometimes and often a lot of the best stories are sensitive politically, and
you can't really avoid criticism when it's a certain topic.
So I think that that's that thin line that everybody is really struggling with. How do you respond to public outrage? Do you agree with them and then change, or do you take a stance and take a stand and say, no, I mean, we stood true to that. So I think that it's easier to take a stand when you know that you have done it in the best way possible, and you have done all of the things that you're supposed to do, and you have followed journalism, all the ethics of journalism properly.
To acknowledge it, at least, you must be completely sure that you have followed your ethics. Like, you've stuck to your ground, your stance, and produced the best possible story
and
out.
Double checked, triple checked, and you were just
verified everything.
Aware that, and something else that really helps us is also just thinking about the point of the story.
Why are you telling this story?
Why are you telling the story, and are you reporting it in this way? Is it going to be counterproductive? Because that's really that's not the point of the story. You don't want to talk about a particular issue and have the person that you spoke about, or the group that you spoke about, actually hurt in this particular scenario. So that's just another thing that we try to maintain
as well.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope I didn't put you in trouble there with some of the questions. It was really great to see so much of engagement from the participants today as well. So that brings us to the close of our first webinar on understanding critical media literacy. Just want to say a big thank you to our partners, UNESCO APSU and Raw Media, for making this possible. And also a big thank you to you, Sakeena and Kris, for engaging and having a very interesting experiential sharing session this afternoon. We also just want to highlight that this is just a precursor to the overall program that we have lined up. We have an extensive training on critical media literacy, which is in partnership with UNESCO, APSU, and UNDP Sri Lanka. So do check out our social media platforms for more details of this at the end of this webinar series. We're also hoping to conduct this webinar series in Sinhala and Tamil, so please do keep a lookout for that as well. So the next webinar, which will be on understanding conspiracy theories and false news, will take place next Wednesday. That's the 19th of August 2020. So do stay tuned to our social media on how you can register for this as well. Thank you everyone for being a part of this afternoon's session, and we hope you have a good evening. Thanks.